Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar, which is brought to you by Shared Services Link and in association with PI. Today we're looking at new processes and technology that will help you improve your supply chain resilience. My name is Susie West and I am your host for today, and I'm very pleased to be presenting as our two guest speakers, Nick Wildgoose, who is Supply Chain Product Leader at Zurich Insurance, and Andy White, who is Director of Risk Solutions at PI. It's great to have these speakers and experts indeed with us today. You, as always, have a key role to play in what you get out of today's session, which is to make sure that you get your questions answered. So do post those through to me as early as you possibly can, and I will put your question to our speakers in the last 10 minutes of the webinar, so do make sure that you stay on the line for that. We also have 3 poll questions today. We do look for very high levels of participation, really within the region of about 70% participation. So please do respond as accurately as you can. We will be sharing the results live, and of course that's great for benchmarking purposes. So let's just take a few moments just to think about why we're here today and why we're having this conversation today. I think many of us are becoming increasingly aware of the fact that weaknesses within our supply chain can cause enough damage to potentially take us out of business, or take us very close to being in a place where we could be out of business. Risks do vary right the way across the spectrum, from having made wrong supplier choices, and maybe from a lack of due diligence, maybe from a lack of information, maybe because of the time pressure. When selecting core strategic suppliers, we in the UK only have to look at the recent news with Moonpig, the deliverers of cards and flowers, and the bad press that they got over Mothering Sunday because presents were not delivered. And of course, angry customers go straight to social media these days. So there's a lot of noise made when there are disappointed customers, and that's largely because of a wrong decision made when it came to selecting a core supplier. And risks vary all the way up the spectrum to natural disasters. So having 100% awareness, or at least as close to 100% awareness and visibility of where your risks are within the supply chain, certainly helps you anticipate and plan and be ready for an event that could possibly cause disruption to your business. This webinar examines the Zurich Insurance case study, and we're going to be looking at the processes and technologies that Zurich Insurance have deployed. And hopefully will translate to you that if you can be in a similar situation to Zurich Insurance, you'll certainly be in a position where you can help to protect your reputation, your top line, and indeed your bottom line through improving your supply chain resilience. So before I hand over to Nick, our first speaker, I would like to run 2 of our poll questions back to back. So coming up on your screen now, and just to remind you, we do look for 70% participation, please. So let's see if we can get up to that number. The first poll question is regarding visibility within your supply chain today. You've got 3 options. How much visibility would you say that you have of your supply chain today? Full visibility, partial visibility, or no visibility at all? So full visibility, partial visibility, or no visibility at all. We are at a very high number, 74% of you responding. So closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. Let's have a look at the results. Okay, coming up on your screen now, we're closed the poll on 81%, so very positive. You can see there that the majority of the viewers today on this webinar, 66% of you, have partial visibility of your supply chain. And as far as in second place, we've got 24% of you saying no visibility and 10% of you in a very privileged position where you have full visibility. So interesting results there. Let's move on to our second poll question coming up on your screen now. Let's see if we can beat that previous number of 81% participation. Have you had any form of supply chain disruption in the last 12 months? Major disruption, yes, minor disruption, or no disruption at all. So have you had any form of supply chain disruption in the last 12 months? Yes, major disruption, yes, minor disruption, or no disruption at all. So we're at 75% of you responding. Let's close the poll in 3, 2, 1. Okay, close that poll on 75% of you responding. Thank you for that. Coming up on the screen now. So just over half of respondents here have experienced minor disruption within the supply chain in the last 12 months, followed in position number 2 with 26% of you fortunately saying no disruption. 22% of you have indeed experienced major disruption, so just shy of a quarter of you have experienced major disruption in the last 12 months. Okay, with those two polls done, I would now like to introduce our first speaker. Over to you, please, Nick Wildgoose.
Hi, everybody. Yes, so it's pleasing to see that a number of you, in a sad way, have a large number of disruptions going on. In terms of that makes this very relevant to you. So starting off with, what are your challenges at the moment? It's not just about disruptions, it's also about, I'm sure, lowering costs. So where do you focus your efforts? You only have so many resources. I'm sure that's another challenge. And I hate to worry you, but there's more risk coming along. The Global Risk Report indicated, which is published by Zurich, and I recommend you read it, comes out in January each year. And if you want a copy, get in touch with me. And that showed that risks are on the rise. I'm sure you've seen in your supply chains geopolitical risk, cat risk last year, in terms of a number of floods, for example, in India, impacting a lot of people. So there are a number of challenges out there. I think we'd all accept, particularly looking at those poll results, that you need to be doing something different. And you may say, well, do I care in that sense? What do supply chain disruptions mean for me? The first thing to say is your CEOs probably have as one of their most common KPIs delivering to the customer on time. And supply chain disruption clearly impacts on that. And then, what are the consequences if you have a supply chain disruption? As you can see in these slides here, 38% of companies have had a significant impact, or it's been an impact on their growth. This comes from work by Vinod Singhal, where he looked at 800 companies quoted on the US stock exchange to look at the impact, and a 38% benchmark impact. That's very significant. And that was backed up by some work by PwC, where they saw an 11% drive on shareholder value. Either one of those figures is very important. So you should care about supply chain disruptions. You should have supply chain risk management on your agenda. In terms of disruptions then, let's look at the latest BCI report. It came out in October last year. Again, if you want a copy of that, very happy to provide it. 74% of companies had a significant supply chain disruption. That, interestingly enough, is almost in line with you as a group. So I think you represent the normal population, unfortunately. And I'm sure I've worked as a procurement professional. Many of you, like me, are focused on your tier 1 suppliers and thinking, if I get that right, at least I'm solving my problems. Sorry, that isn't the case. As you can see from this slide, 29% of the disruptions are coming below tier 1, hence the importance of driving supply chain visibility. And how are you going to do that without the use of technology? Later, Andy will show you how, with big data and other sources, you can start to peel back and create that 100% visibility. By the way, I would challenge those 10% who said they've got full visibility of the supply chain. I'd like to meet you all individually, if I may, because I've never seen anybody actually achieve that globally in the last 7 years of talking to many of the largest corporate customers of Zurich, and they have sometimes thousands of people working in their supply chain and no lack of technology. So we're happy to take that offline and delighted to meet you for those who've achieved it. So what else does this study say? And by the way, again, as I say, I'd encourage reading it. I can't, I could spend an hour just on the study, but then I'd be in deep trouble with the Andy and the team here. But let's look at visibility from the study. So 72% in our study, and by the way, 500 plus companies responded to this. They're mainly mid to large size companies, mainly out of Europe and US, but clearly they're looking at supply chains over the world. As you can see, 72% there did not have full visibility, and again I would challenge those that say they've got full visibility. Do they mean full visibility of tier 1? I can understand that, but even then, do they really know where all their supplier factories are? Or have, as I've seen many times, they've just got the accounting address, which is not much good when you get an issue, and I'll come on to that later in some examples. There's one other important statistic on this slide. 33% of respondents say they haven't got top-level management commitment. If you haven't got top-level management commitment, don't even start on this exercise. So Andy and I are hopefully going to help you get that top-level management commitment. And the way in which you do that is to take your most profitable product or service and look at the bill of materials or the key suppliers involved and think, if they failed, what would be the impact on your results? I remember about 5 years ago being with a large Finnish company, and they had gone through that exercise, simply built a very simple model in Excel. And when the board saw that they were exposed to the level of 100 million euros plus from one single supplier, that was their call to action. That's when things changed. That's when the procurement, supply chain team and risk teams got together and said, we need to do something about this. So that's the kind of trigger for movement. I guess you'd also be interested, if you haven't read this report, in terms of what are the causes of supply chain disruption, because often we focus on physical supply chains. But supply chains aren't only about the physical flow of goods, but how can you operate these days without the information that goes alongside it? So, for example, how would you operate a warehouse without the warehouse IT system? Or how do you track your goods? And you can see, perhaps you're not surprised by this, that the number one cause of supply chain disruptions is failures in IT and telecoms outage. Number two, and this is written through the charts, we've been doing this work, as I say, over 7 years, is cyber attacks and data breaches. And then what you probably guessed before this webinar comes in adverse weather, so floods and so on. And remember, when you're looking at these kind of impacts, think not only about your supplier's premises, but also the logistics hubs and so on that your goods might be going through. We found on many occasions, I can talk about a major FMCG company, where they suddenly realized, after they've done the analysis of their supply chain, that there were actually 3 of their divisions were using the same East Coast port in the US to ship into the US. So if there was any problem with that port, for example, a strike or a blockage, it wasn't just impacting on the results of one division, but actually 3 divisions. Again, you can imagine that concentration of risk and what impact that had on that company and the way in which they acted. So I hope I've got you scared enough. I'm afraid insurance people all we seem to do is love scaring people. But now I want to move on to something I hope is more productive and helping you actually solve the problem rather than giving you too many sleepless nights without a solution. So how do we go about a supply chain risk assessment? And we've been doing many of these across the globe in the last 7 years. And we continue to learn, and we have I have the privilege of working with many different companies on these. So the first step we take is, and I touched on it earlier, identify who your key suppliers are. Who are the critical suppliers and their vulnerabilities. And I talked about that in terms of value at risk is the key thing we use. Not where you're spending the most money, which is a common mistake. And I'll put my hand up and say, 10 years ago, I would have done just the same when somebody came to see me and said, what are your key suppliers, Nick? I would have looked at my spend analysis. As I say, please look at the impact on your revenue and profitability. And then, having identified who those key suppliers are, and start to map them out and understand where the risk exposures are. And the whole process here is then to prioritize your mitigation actions and your support decisions. So it doesn't matter so much how precise your measures of disruption are, but more that prioritization. So I know many companies out there that are doing this successfully just break down their risk into high, medium, and low, and then put a broad value range on it. And that's enough to get you started on the journey and to get the senior management support that I talked about being necessary. This is a challenge, mind, without technology, hence the reason we've combined this presentation into not just the processes, but the technology. So, as I think you all know, companies can be extremely complex in their setup, and the supply chains that you're dealing with can be extremely dynamic. This is kind of a document just to get you worried, or a diagram that just gets you worried, just understanding the hierarchy. And I know all of you professionals in the procurement supply chain space will appreciate this, just keeping track of who owns whom and where they're located. If you try to do that manually, it's an impossibility, I would say. And when you combine that with a multi-tier supply chain, and let's look at that in a few moments, then how do you understand your value chain, the customers and hierarchies? Think about the whole value chain, by the way, when you're looking at this, your critical value chain. Don't just think about the supply chain up the chain, as I say, but look at the transport, links, the logistics hubs, and look at it out to the customer side. It's important you understand all of those values as they flow through the whole network, because that's ultimately, if you don't get your goods to the final customer or provide your services, clearly you've had a disruption and you have a problem. And you'll get that call. I think I'll bring this up now, an example. I was talking to a number of our customers back at the time of the tsunami in March 2011 in Japan. And I don't know whether any of you on this call got that call from your CEO, but some of them did, to say, this was on a Saturday, by the way, just to make it even more pleasant to get a call from your CEO, where he or she would say, and no, we have some key suppliers in Japan. Are we affected? Could you even answer that question today? I wonder. I suspect in many cases not. I had the pleasure with working with companies, some companies who actually had mapped out their key supplier locations in Japan. They knew precisely where they were. They were in regular contact with them. And so when their CEO asked that question, by Monday, Tuesday of the following week, they were beginning to shape up where there would be supply chain challenges from their company point of view, even to the extent of making purchases of inventory out there to secure their production. I also know of a much larger group of companies and organizations who were scrambling around trying to work out where in Japan they actually had these factories, who their key contact was. I came to talk to you about that earlier. They probably had the head office address in Tokyo, the accounting office, but didn't precisely know that they had a production facility in Sendai, for example, which, just for amusement, by the way, was a Merck factory that unfortunately got destroyed, and it was the only producer of pigment for black paint. So you couldn't get a car with black metallic paint, which, following Henry Ford back in the 1930s, told us we could have any coloured car as long as it was black. It's ironic that human progress 80 years later meant that we could have any car but black. Anyway, in terms of supplier routing as well, clearly it's important to understand how your nodes fit together. I think it's useful to think about a supply chain as a set of nodes. And I'm sure a number of us have been caught out, or I've had a procurement policy. Let's not group more of our expenditure than 20% with a particular supplier. But when you draw out a diagram sometimes, you'll find out that, goodness, they actually supply somebody else who's a tier 2 supplier, and then that tier 2 supplier also supplies back to you. And this is a public example of that in a very large industry. That's where I'll share it with you if you haven't heard about it. It's a very good example that you can use in your own company to show even big industries with substantial and great supply chain teams can get caught out. And that's the explosion that happened at a company called Evonik. And they actually produced a product that fed into the brake resin in the automotive industry. And the automotive industry realized when there was an explosion at this part of this factory that they had a 20% challenge in terms of capacity in the marketplace. But actually, when they further investigated, because a byproduct went from that factory to another supplier, the shortage for the industry was much higher than that. And you can imagine that industry then invested in substantial resources in overcoming what could have been an issue, stopping production lines for many automotive makers. So again, I think that's a good little case study for you to bring in to any analysis you're doing to support the case to move this forward. I just now want to share with you another kind of important point before I hand back or go across to Andy, and that's around making sure that your risk assessment is comprehensive. And I've brought up a lot of boxes here. You'll probably say, Nick, this is a crazy slide. There's far too many things on there. But that's the point. And let me illustrate that. I have spoken to a number of procurement people over the years, and again, I say I was guilty of it, and people would ask me about supply chain risk, and I would say, I look, for example, at the chances of financial failure in my supplier, and I use all the major organizations out there that can check on financial failure, and I would imagine that was supply chain risk management. And I wonder how many of you on the call today see that in the same way. But do you check, for example, the open and closed legal cases against your supplier? You know you can do that for a few dollars nowadays. And wouldn't it be useful to know that they've perhaps been, suffered a case against them for child labour in a certain jurisdiction, or they've had an issue in terms of environmental challenges in a particular region, or they'd stolen, if you're in the IT-related area, some IP and been sued by somebody. Another kind of true story is a number of the high-tech IT companies were all caught out by the same Chinese supplier. 1 year after another, the Chinese supplier just one to the other because none of them were checking on the open cases, which was the reason their predecessors had moved away because they were basically trying to steal the IP of these tech companies. The other thing is, just taking some of the boxes on here, how many of you check just very simply, understanding where these are your critical suppliers, as we say we're talking about, where are their factories located, the ones that you rely on? And are those factories in flood zones, windstorm, or quake zones? Why wouldn't you want to know that? You know, and obviously not compound the problem, by the way, which I've seen happen by putting other key suppliers in the same natural catastrophe area. So you're actually building up your value at risk. And that is what we're doing at these top 4 boxes when we look at economic, geographic, political and structural issues. Say, for example, we look at tyres for the mining industry. They're quite a specialist commodity. And as we know, the mining industry, unfortunately, is in a bit of a downturn at the moment. But when it picks up, huge stresses get put on the supply chain. And any minor disruption will have a significant impact. So shouldn't you know who are the suppliers in that industry? If you're a key source, where are the other suppliers sat and situated? You know, is it in the same political risk area, same geography? What is their kind of structure like in terms of, by that I mean, how financially stable is that particular industry? You know, are they making decent profits or not? And I think just to pick out one other box on this chart, I'm very happy to answer further questions on this webinar or later about this kind of comprehensive approach. But let's think about supplier relationships. We would regard all of our critical suppliers by their very nature as being very important to us. But are you, as I like to describe and it's commonly used, their customer of choice? In other words, if they get a problem, say they've got 2 factories in the world, and one of the factories has a flood, has some other problem, is it going to be you who gets that limited supply, or is it going to be your competitor? Do you really understand whether you're the customer of choice? Okay, I hope that's kind of illustrated some of those challenges. And just a final point on new product development. And again, my procurement colleagues, you have my sympathies, because I've been through this challenge, whereby the engineers in the R&D department in your company, driven probably by sales, have this brilliant new product idea, and they find this wonderful new supplier that's going to help them do it. What they don't realize is they're operating, I'm exaggerating to make the point here, out of a large garage at the back of a house, I don't know, somewhere near Winchester on a river. And then when the idea is accepted by the CEO and says, let's ramp this up, you have significant problems, and they only bring procurement in at the end. So I think it's a kind of joint responsibility. We need to educate them as well in the kind of things and this due diligence, and hopefully this kind of framework gives you an approach to do that. And at this point, I will hand back to Susie in terms of, we'll give you another poll question.
That's great. Many thanks indeed, Nick. So 3rd and final poll question coming up on the screen now. What technology do you use in supply chain risk assessment today? Perhaps you use specialist software, maybe Excel. Nothing today, but you are indeed looking to implement, or nothing today and not indeed looking to implement anything as such. Please tick the box most appropriate to you and tell us a bit about what technology you use in your supply chain risk assessment today. Specialist software, Excel, nothing today, but indeed looking to change this, nothing today and not really looking to change this as such. Closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. Let's have a look at the results. We're at 68% of you responding there. Okay, so just shy of half of you use Excel today, coming in at 44%, followed at 26% by you using specialist software. 19% saying don't use anything today, but indeed are looking to implement. And the minority with 11% of you saying don't use anything today and not looking to implement anything as such. Your minds may change over the course of the next 15 to 20 minutes when we have a look at some very exciting technology. So I'd now like to hand over, please, to Andy White.
Thank you very much, Susie. Very nice to meet you all virtually today. That's some potentially quite interesting results, and it will be interesting in the questions at the end to hear from those both who have said that they have specialist software currently in use, as well as those potentially at the other end of the spectrum currently not using anything, what their thoughts are off the back of what we're hopefully going to excite you guys with over the course of the next 15 minutes. I just want to take 2 minutes at the start here to talk about a requirement really to take a range of approaches in order to have a comprehensive understanding of your supply chain risk. Nick's already mentioned this morning, in the first half of the session today. It's key to ensure that there are a number of approaches taken here. Looking at supply chain risk from just one perspective is not going to give a comprehensive overview of the challenges that are out there. What we're going to do for the next 10 minutes or so is take a real life example. This is a real business that we've been working with for a number of years now, and how we can use these different approaches to really understand their risk from a supply chain point of view, and take you through some examples as to how they've actually used the technology and this approach to provide a more comprehensive coverage and mitigate some of the potential challenges and issues that they come across through day-to-day working. Hopefully everyone can now see my screen, and what we can see here is, as I said, an example of one specific business, and what we're looking at is an overview of their supply chain. This is it's a subset of their supply chain. It's a set of their critical suppliers, and what we can see immediately is that this is providing a global view of that supply chain. They have potential challenges in pretty much every single continent in the world. What we're also doing is providing two additional pieces of key information within the view here. There is a color scheme that you can see at the bottom, and what this is doing for us is it's highlighting where we have specific suppliers that have been identified as potentially being at risk. What that means is that there is potentially a problem with them as a company, and this comes back to some of the aspects that Nick was mentioning earlier, such as the political stability of the company, things around their legal status, and that kind of thing. Alongside that, we're providing a second metric, which is the specific value at risk for that specific customer or that specific supplier, and this is represented by the size of the circle here, so we can actually start to see on a supplier by supplier basis the detail of that value at risk. We can select an individual one and drill into this. And what this will do is it will provide more information for us. This has been anonymized for obvious reasons, but it will provide more information for us in relation to who that supplier is and meta information about that supplier itself. We can see the actual exposure number that we're looking at here, that value at risk, as well as information from the CRM side around the relationship with that supplier, things like renewal dates for contracts and so on and so forth. What I'm going to do now is take you through a couple of examples specifically in relation to the US here. So I'm going to just select these suppliers in the United States here, drill into those. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through some examples initially from a natural catastrophe perspective to show you how this business has actually gone about understanding their potential loss scenarios through different natural disasters. And we're going to start here by just overlaying a view of earthquakes on the screen. And what this is going to give us is the ability to actually identify very quickly where we've got high risk hazard zones from an earthquake point of view. And by actually selecting these, what we can do is we can identify the suppliers that sit within that zone. Over and above that, we can bring in an additional view that starts to provide us with an accumulation picture, both in terms of our total value at risk at the top here, as well as an estimated value at risk. And this is a metric that some of our customers have that allows them to not only look at this from a worst case scenario point of view, but also to do sets of modeling with their data around their supply chain. The benefit here from a business point of view is pretty obvious in that this has immediately allowed them to understand, in the case of a bad earthquake on the west coast of the US, what is our loss scenario? How can we mitigate against that in advance? And this has been quite key for them, because they've not only used this from a single hazard perspective. What they've also done is applied multiple hazard overlays to allow them to understand not only where do I have single locations of risk from one natural disaster, but also in this case applying overlays that pull out, in this case, historical hurricanes, to allow them to not only model single scenarios, but to take that high-level picture and understand from a larger perspective, have we got areas where we're not only at risk for one natural catastrophe, other areas where we have multiple potential challenges in a certain geolocation. Nick mentioned this earlier as well, and I'm going to touch on it again. The example Nick gave was the West Coast labour strikes that happened last year, and as I'm sure some of you will know, there are similar negotiations going on in relation to the East Coast this year. I'm aware that this customer in question has done a large amount of analysis, specifically looking at their customers on the East Coast of the US, with the aim of actually exactly understanding what is our current risk within that location, but also taking that down to a more granular level. So saying, okay, I also want to understand within that, what are these suppliers providing us with? Are they unique in terms of the products within our supply chain? And in those cases, how can we go about identifying alternative suppliers should there be a challenge, should there be a problem come the summer this year? And this, I know, is something that they've already gone through the process of doing to make sure that if there is such an issue, they've got the ability to source those materials from other places, even if that supplier isn't currently part of their supply chain. And this is just one example. There are a number of examples that we can obviously call upon over the last 12 months with Tianjin as an example, where there are unpredictable scenarios that need to be mitigated against, and the challenge for being able to model what those scenarios look like, understanding what impact that would have on our supply chain, is very difficult without really being able to visualize this in a true analytical format. what I'm going to do now is go on to talk a bit about not only looking at specifically the suppliers that exist within our supply chain here, but also some additional metrics that we can pull in to help really understand what the global picture from a supply chain disruption perspective looks like. And what you can see on the screen here is the purple dots representing those same suppliers that we were looking at previously, but also the pink dots. And these come from a separate proprietary database that has been developed by Zurich, ourselves, and Bath University over the past 7 years or so. And this database contains approximately 12 years of history of major supply chain disruptions from around the world. I haven't got enough time, unfortunately, today to go into this in detail, but if anyone is interested in following up on this and would appreciate some more information on this, please get in touch and we'd be more than happy to take you through that. The key information that we are pulling in here is an overview of the disruptions globally that have happened that relate specifically to the industry of so in this case, the automotive industry of the suppliers in question here. And what we can do here is we can actually start to understand not only the information about our suppliers, but also the impact of, be it global political risk, be it logistics within a country, and how that impacts our supply chain. What we're going to bring in on the right-hand side here is something known as Logistics Performance Index. And this is a 6-point metric that is broken down by the components that you can see on the right-hand side here. And fundamentally, this gives, on a country-by-country basis, an overview of their performance across different areas, including shipments and internal logistics, as well as other metrics. And what this allows us to do is to understand not only where our suppliers are, but also what is the performance of that part of the world. So let's take China specifically as an example here. What we can see on the right-hand side here is actually from an LPI perspective, this is quite a positive performing part of the world in comparison to the global picture. What we can then also do is bring in a view of our supply chain as well and look at how that benchmarks compared to the supply chain we have from a global point of view. And again, this touches on something that Nick was mentioning earlier. We can bring in both that estimated and maximum value at risk, which is how we feel people should be analysing their supply chain, but we can also look at it from a value of supply perspective as well. So looking at that procurement spend analysis piece to bring in both angles and understand really what is the view of our suppliers within a certain geographical subset. Okay, I hope everyone found that interesting, and we very much appreciate any follow-up questions. At this point, I'm going to hand back to Nick, and he's going to take you through some real examples as to how businesses within the industry have been impacted by supply chain.
Yeah, thank you for that, Andy. 44% of you said you were using Excel as a tool, and obviously it's a fantastic tool, but I hope we've convinced you that maybe there is other technology around that could enhance what you're doing at the moment. And another point that we haven't brought out this afternoon, but is a very key point in driving forward a supply chain risk initiative, is loading up and cleaning up the data in the first place. And we have come up with a number of tools to do that, to make sure you're looking at kind of the right supplier location, that you understand who the group is, are they part of a particular hierarchy or how they link in. but coming on to some stories around how this has been used in practice. So I'm not going to necessarily go through every one of the cases on this slide, but let me just start with one, because these are all based on our experience over the last 7 years. Is a French company where, frankly, a colleague of mine went across to meet them at the invitation of the risk director to meet the supply chain and procurement team. And you can imagine a French company inviting an Englishman over to France is already a challenge. And I think when the risk directors said they were getting Zurich in, they were thinking, what does Zurich Insurance as an insurer really know about supply chain risk? But the mood of the meeting, I'm pleased to say, changed quite quickly because the procurement team started off quite rightly by saying, and they had invested a lot by dual sourcing all the key components in their most profitable good, or piece of electronics, in fact, and it was around 80% of their profitability. But when we got into the next question, my colleague did, and the risk director said, so where have you dual sourced? And they very proudly said, well, we've got both of the suppliers in Mexico, and they're only 5 kilometers apart, so that means it's much cheaper for us to visit both of them at the same time. And he looked at them somewhat aghast. I mean, I'm sure you're aghast on this webinar, because if it wasn't true, I couldn't make it up, could I? And they suddenly, the penny clicked with them, because, you know, he was obviously pointing out the nat cat risks in Mexico, and that maybe that wasn't the best bit of dual sourcing that had been done. And clearly then the meeting became extremely productive, led to a lot of great work, and I think the story's got a happy ending, like Once Upon a Time with a happy ending. So that's nice to know. But that's just one example. I'll pick one more off this slide before I move on, and that's in terms, again, and I've been guilty of this, I'm sure, in terms of, the backup for this particular product. This relates to a US company where they said, don't worry, Zurich, we have a backup supplier for this key component, this material, and it's out of China. We thought, fantastic, the good work, procurement have ticked the box, they have backups. But when we actually checked on that component, or that commodity, in fact it was in that sense, we found out that China has got a ban on exports of that particular commodity stroke component, and therefore it wasn't a backup plan at all. So if they'd had the problem with their local US supplier, the backup didn't work. And I talked earlier about a number of cases. I hope you're not going to be in the position of those procurement and supply chain people when that CEO rings you up around the next disaster that strikes the world, and unfortunately there will be others in supply chains, and he asks, are we impacted? And you haven't got the answer back to him or her within a reasonable time. So just to recap in terms of, why should you even bother to improve your supply chain risk management? In other words, follow what I call the resilience imperative. You can't wait any longer. I started off earlier saying deliveries for your customer on time is the most common key performance indicator, and I know it applies to many of you on this call. If you don't do that, your competitors will take over typically, and winning back a customer is a big challenge. So fundamentally, this is all about protecting your profitability, but in a way that doesn't burn up too much resource to do it. I know you have my sympathy. We don't have enough time today to do even some of the critical tasks we'd like to do. So we need technology to help us. How do you monitor your top 80 suppliers without technology? How can you pull in all the different risk factors that we've talked about this afternoon without technology? I mean, all I can say is good luck if you can do it without technology. I would have thought it's an impossibility, frankly. So you get a number of benefits from this, and I'll just pick out a few of these. Better informed decision making. Shouldn't you, as procurement and supply chain professionals and those associated with those processes, where you say our job, our professional job, is to minimize the total cost of ownership of a particular good? When you say that, surely you need to take account of risk and the fact that, okay, you've saved, I don't know, $10 on a component, but if you stop your production line for more than a few hours, probably the annualized savings have already gone. So think about risk when you're sourcing components. It will also help on avoiding volatility in your business results. And as you know, these crises, you'll have read them in the paper, have created many problems for companies in terms of their results. And you know from our study that unfortunately they continue at a high level. So in conclusion, this is a call to action. Reactive is not good enough. You need to be proactive. I hope we've convinced you of that. If you haven't got a map of your critical supply chains, by the way, I'm not promising what Susie said, 100% visibility of every single supply chain. I don't think you need to do that. But for your critical supply chains, please get the message. Reactive is not good enough. I hope as a wild goose I'm allowed to put an ostrich on my last slide. Now maybe this could be a wild goose with his head buried, but I hope not. But please don't keep putting your head in the sand and avoiding this. I'm sure unfortunately many of our professional colleagues have had their career damaged by failing to look at this area. And let's look at the positive side of this. If you get this right, this is an opportunity to beat your competitors. It's an opportunity to improve your results. It's extremely difficult, but the technology and the big data is coming along to help you. So at that point, I will hand back to Susie and we'll answer a few questions. Thanks.
That's great. Many thanks indeed, Nick, and thank you to Andy. So if you haven't already posted your question, please do so. But let's kick off with a number of questions that have come through. So let's put this to Andy initially, and Nick, you might want to chime in as well. Andy, when you were showing us the demo, there was obviously a view of the risks within the supply chain. How much data do you actually need to provide? Nick was talking about loading up the data. A couple of questions. How much data do you need to provide to get that kind of full view? And how much of that data is provided by PI and how much of it is provided by the client? Sorry, PI and the client.
So to pick up the first question in relation to the data, this depends very much on the organisation. What we look to take initially is basically an overview of the supply chain from mostly a procurement perspective, picking out specifically the critical suppliers. This will vary between, in some cases, 100, in some cases, larger numbers. We have some clients where this number is getting on towards 10,000. And then alongside that, there are a number of pieces of information and data that we augment that come directly from within PI and within Zurich that help to understand that supply chain picture, including things like Dun & Bradstreet and the LPI piece that I've already mentioned.
Okay.
Yeah, so just to add to that, yes,
please, yeah.
To add to that, yeah, so there's, we clearly have a number of risk data sets we can overlay onto the data. So the key thing we need from customers is those critical suppliers, and we can help them identify the geolocation of those suppliers, although ideally we need at least the address. And then we also can work with them on the value at risk if they don't know it. And with that information, you can start to build some of these models. So we can automate a lot of this process, and our ability also to get down through to understand some of the sub-tier suppliers is literally improving, and I probably don't exaggerate, week by week, driven by new regulations around, for example, the Modern Slavery Act, the Dodd-Frank Act, and so on, which is encouraging, if not enforcing, more visibility down the tiers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question, and again, maybe this is directed at both of you, so we'll start with Andy. Is this a one-off project that once it's implemented, it kind of pretty much ticks over by itself, or is it a constant program that possibly requires ongoing support and resource?
So we generally find that the initial exercise to populate the information is then a very straightforward process going forward, and a lot of the information that updates on a regular basis will be information that will come from external sources to the customer. So once that initial set of data around the critical suppliers is loaded, that is by and large the major piece that the customer is required to do. There is generally an update on a regular basis of sorts after that, but we generally find that is a pretty straightforward process for them to undertake, given the initial work in the first place.
Yeah, Susie, just to add to that, the professionals on the phone will know that sometimes they get challenged and say, people change their supply chains every day. You don't change your critical suppliers very often, because there's such an effort involved in doing that. That can be tremendously disruptive in its sense. So there's an element of stability in that. Where the data varies more frequently is around the risk information, the news feeds and so on, that once you have your critical supply chain mapped out, you can overlay and update more frequently, and that doesn't involve a client effort.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose just to add to that as well, one of the key pieces, or one of the key things about ensuring that the update frequency of the reporting is there, is around the fact that, and Nick touched on this earlier as well, there are a large number of changes that happen on a daily basis in relation to things like company ownership, and looking at, exactly as Nick says, at things like news feeds and understanding risks within certain geo areas is key. But this isn't a requirement on the client to keep that data feed up to date. That's part of the service.
Okay, good. You referenced, Andy, benchmarking. If you sign up to use the Pi solution, are you naturally part of the benchmarking? Is that something that you get as part of the kind of the service?
So shall I'll start to answer that question, if I may, Susie. So from a supply chain risk assessment point of view, we do have, what good looks like, or what very good looks like in each of the 23 risk areas that we look at. So we do actually, in a sense, benchmark and score, and we can compare across companies and track improvements. So I'm delighted to say a high-tech company that was one of our first customers now 6 years ago, we've seen them improve their supply chain risk management over the 6 years to a considerable extent, and that's kind of benchmarked. Clearly that could be tracked in the technology. We haven't routinely done that kind of benchmarking, but we do it as on an individual basis. It's not impossible from a risk assessment, and then we could show it in the tool. In fact, we showed the demo of that at an AIRMIC conference about 4 years ago. That's a risk kind of conference, the UK risk conference. Is that answering the question all right, Susie?
Yes, I think that's good. So we've got two final questions before we close this webinar. So let's just start with, Nick, you mentioned a report at the beginning of the webinar. I believe it was based on 800 respondents participating. The respondents for that report, were they generally cross-industry, or was there a kind of a weighing of representation towards a particular industry there?
Yeah, I've mentioned, I think, 3 reports throughout at this webinar. So, and
it was the one with about 800.
2 of them. Well, yeah. So that's the thing that'll work. So I'd urge you as professionals to read all these. They can give you a lot of business benefit. So the Global Risk Report is something I suspect your CEO has a look at, so it can be very useful to refer to, and that's available from the Zurich website. The BCI report, which is around disruption, and to get to your specific question, that was a Vinod Singhal piece of research he did with a few colleagues in the States on quoted companies, an extensive piece of work, you say 800 quoted companies where he went to their SEC reports. And I don't know whether it's loaded onto a website, but I can certainly send you a copy of that report. It's a long read. I think it's about 100 pages. There's a lot of analysis in there. And as I say, PwC picked up on it.
Okay, great. Well, if anybody would like the report, maybe they can get in contact with Andrew. So andrew.white@p-i.net. We are out of time, so thank you very much to both of our presenters, to Nick Wildgoose and to Andy White. If you would like to make sure that you diarise some upcoming webinars that we've got at Shared Services Link, we've got well over 6 scheduled in our upcoming series, so do make sure that you're fully aware of what they are and do register for the ones that apply to you. And we have a number of conferences coming up as well. Our Shared Services Leader Summit taking place next week in London, and our North American Global Process Owner Summit taking place in Seattle in May. Thank you very much for your time and attention today. We look forward to welcoming you next time. Thank you and goodbye.